They told me never to disturb the hearth. My grandmother said the house remembered things better left untouched, but when I pried back a loose beam in the old kitchen, I found what it had been hiding for over a century, a ledger, folded and yellowed, smelling faintly of ash. Inside were names, dozens of them. At first I thought it was a guest list or maybe old inventory, but when I compared the dates, I saw they matched a string of sudden deaths whispered about in the valley. Masters, overseers, men who never made it past middle age. People said there was illness or fever or God's judgment, but my blood ran cold when I realized this wasn't coincidence. This ledger wasn't a cookbook, it was a reckoning, written by the woman who cooked every meal, a woman enslaved in these mountains in 1850, who turned her chains into weapons no one could see. She left no confession, no signature, only careful strokes of ink enough to ensure her story would one day surface. And now it has. This is her testimony. This is her vengeance. This is how she fed them death. The Appalachian Mountains have always carried a kind of silence that is heavier than most places. It is not the silence of peace, nor the hush of untouched wilderness. It is something older, thicker, and more watchful, like the land itself remembers. In certain hollows, the air clings to you, and the trees seem to lean closer, as though they are whispering secrets only the dead can understand. It is in one of these forgotten hollows, tucked away beneath tangled pines and rolling mist, that the story of the cursed cabin begins. Even now, the cabin stands, its roof long since collapsed, its chimney cracked and leaning like a gravestone. The wood is rotted black, swollen from years of storms, yet the frame remains stubborn, refusing to fall completely. Travelers who pass through say they feel a chill if they linger near it too long. Some insist the air there tastes bitter, like something spoiled. Others claim that if you stand at the doorway, you will hear the faint scrape of a spoon across the bottom of a pot, steady, rhythmic, patient. The locals avoid it, even in the daylight, even in an age when most dismiss such talk as superstition. There are places that folks simply do not enter. Children dare one another to creep close, to peek through the broken windows, but rarely do they stay long. The cabin don't want visitors, the elders say, and when pressed for answers, their faces tighten and they shake their heads. Best not to ask too much. Some stories ain't meant to be stirred up, but there is always one person, maybe a traveler, maybe an outsider, who ignores such warnings. They'll want to know what happened there, why the cabin feels like it is waiting, and so the whispers return. They tell of a woman, a slave forced to live and work in that home, her name erased by those who owned her. She was not remembered for her laughter, her pain, or her prayers, but for the food she cooked. For years she fed the family that kept her in chains. She prepared their feasts, their Sunday meals, their midnight cravings. Yet her story did not end as most do. They say she found a way to feed them death. The year was 1842, a time when the mountains were both sanctuary and prison. The family who owned the cabin was not rich by the standards of the lowlands, but they had enough land to work others, enough wealth to live while others suffered. Their meals were always heavy with meat and butter, cornbread and preserves, pies sweetened with sugar brought from faraway ports. But the cook never tasted these things. Her meals were scraps, her portions meager, her body sustained by will more than nourishment, and yet her food carried something deeper. To those who ate at that table, it was comfort, warmth, tradition. To her, it was control. They did not know what she whispered into the pots as she stirred. They did not see how her eyes burned as she kneaded dough, or how her hands lingered too long when she measured herbs. The kitchen became her domain, the one place where her hands dictated life and death. Generations later, when the story is told, it is never the same twice. Some say she poisoned the family slowly, mixing just enough of a bitter root into each dish to sap their strength. Others claim she waited for a grand feast, a night when neighbors filled the table and struck all at once. Whatever the truth, the ending is always the same. The cabin filled with choking, writhing silence, and afterward nothing was ever the same. What unsettles people most is not the deaths themselves, but what came after. The land did not heal. Families who tried to live there grew sick. Water drawn from the well tasted wrong, and livestock refused to drink. Children who strayed too close to the cabin at dusk claimed to smell stew simmering, though no fire burned, and when they turned to run, they swore they heard a voice humming low and steady, the same tune their grandmother hummed when stirring pots. By the late 1800s, the cabin had already become a ruin. The family name had faded from records, and the story lived only in whispers passed down by the old. But the fear remained. Preachers tried to bless the place, carving crosses into doorframes, but the wood blackened and split as if rejecting salvation. Hunters avoided the hollow, saying their dogs whined and refused to go near. Even those who did not believe in curses admitted that the cabin felt wrong, like stepping into a room where someone is still breathing though unseen. And so the cabin was left to rot. Nature tried to reclaim it, the vines crawling, the earth swallowing the stones, but still it stood, like a scar that refuses to fade, like a wound that never fully closes. To tell the story is to disturb something. That is why elders lower their voices when they speak of it. That is why travelers quicken their steps when passing by. Because it is not just a tale of the past, it is a reminder that pain leaves marks, that cruelty does not vanish with the dead, that sometimes those who suffer the most find ways to linger, not out of love, but out of hunger for justice. If you ever find yourself wandering those mountains and the mist grows thicker and the air tastes bitter, you may stumble upon it. A cabin leaning in the shadows, a doorway yawning wide like a mouth. Step closer, and you may hear it, the soft scrape of a spoon against iron. Step closer still, and you may smell the stew. That is when you should turn back, because some stories are not meant to be swallowed. Some meals were never meant for you, and yet those who have ignored the warnings never return quite the same. Their eyes are hollow, their hands trembling, their voices broken when they whisper, "She is still cooking, and she is waiting." The year was 1842, and the cabin was not yet the husk that haunts the mountains today. Its roof was whole then, smoke rose from its chimney, and the kitchen fires burned long before the sun lifted itself over the ridges. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of boiling fat, charred wood, and sweat. The kitchen was her prison, her altar, and her battlefield. She had no name that history cared to remember. To the family who owned her, she was nothing more than the cook. To the younger slaves who looked at her with wide eyes, she was something more, an anchor, a survivor, a woman who had learned to hold secrets behind her silent stare. Her hands bore the calluses of a lifetime of work, skin cracked from kneading dough, fingertips raw from scouring pots. The heat of the fire left burns on her forearms, dark scars upon dark skin. Yet her eyes never dull. They burned hotter than the coals beneath the iron stove. The master of the house was a man of cruel appetites. He demanded his food rich, heavy, and endless. Steaks fried in lard, biscuits dripping with butter, pies stuffed with berries and sugar he never harvested himself. His wife fussed about appearances, demanding the table look civilized when visitors came from the lowlands. Their children shrieked for sweets, grabbing with sticky fingers and tossing aside what they did not finish. And through it all she cooked, morning to night. Her life was measured in meals. For the enslaved, hunger was not just an inconvenience, it was a weapon. Their rations were meager, sometimes moldy, sometimes spoiled, always less than enough. Corn mush, a scrap of salt pork, a heel of bread. And if the master was displeased, even that could be withheld. She saw children cry themselves to sleep with hollow bellies. She saw men weaken under the weight of the fields, their strength drained not only by labor but by starvation. Hunger made them obedient. Hunger broke them, but she did not forget what her grandmother had once whispered, back before chains and mountains stole her youth. Food is power. A woman who controls the table controls the heart, the body, the spirit. Though her chains clinked with every step, in the kitchen her hands ruled. With every herb she crushed, every cut she made, she felt a flicker of something the master could never take control. The younger slaves noticed. When scraps were hidden for them in a pocket of cloth, when bitter greens were turned into soup that soothed their stomachs, they looked at her not only with gratitude but with awe. In hushed voices, around the embers of the quarter's fire, they repeated her words. Food carries power, more power than they know. And they began to believe. There were nights when she could hear the master feasting in the next room. Laughter shook the walls, wine sloshed in glasses, and the sound of forks scraping plates echoed like insults. Her stomach growled, but her rage growled louder. She would stand over the fire, sweat running down her temples, and whisper under her breath soft curses spoken into the broth. Bitter truth stirred into the stew. Her hands shook, not with weakness, but with fury. Each meal became more than nourishment. It became a ritual. She did not smile when the family praised her cooking. She only bowed her head, hiding the blaze in her eyes. They thought her silent, obedient, broken. But silence is not always submission. Sometimes silence is sharpening the knife. Sometimes silence is waiting for the right moment. As winter settled over the mountains, the cold gnawed at the cabin walls. Wood cracked in the frost, and the wind howled like the voices of the lost. Food became more important than ever. For the family, it was comfort. For the enslaved, it was survival. For her, it was the measure of power she still held. Each day she fed those who starved her. Each day she bent her back to their table. The fire inside her grew, and with fire comes smoke. Some whispered that she had begun to study the plants of the woods. She lingered longer when sent to gather herbs, bringing back roots and leaves no one else recognized. The Appalachians were full of secrets, plants that could heal and plants that could kill. The old women knew them once, and though chains had stolen much, knowledge has a way of surviving. A pinch of one root could ease pain. A pinch more could end life. Did she experiment? Did she test doses in bowls of broth, meant only for herself? No one can say for certain, but the rumors persisted. She carried herself differently. Her silence seemed heavier, as if she knew something no one else dared to know. The children whispered that when she stirred the pot, the fire bent toward her, as though the flames themselves listened. By spring, her rage was no longer a flicker. It was a steady, consuming fire. She had seen too many nights of empty bellies, too many mornings of screams in the fields, too many afternoons of laughter that mocked her suffering. And so, in the heart of her chains, she found her weapon, not in rebellion with fists of fire, but in the quiet, patient art of cooking. For what is a table, after all, but a place where the powerful believe themselves untouchable? What is a meal, if not trust served on a plate? And so she waited, she bided her time, she stirred and chopped and baked with steady hands, and each day she whispered the same thought to herself: if they will not starve, then they will feast, and that feast will be their undoing. The kitchen fire roared, the ashes fell, and in the rising smoke, the first sparks of vengeance took form. Spring in the Appalachians had a way of making everything seem softer. The trees wore new green, the rivers ran fat with melted snow, and even the air smelled sweet, like wild honeysuckle drifting through the hollows. For the family in the cabin, it was a season of pride. The master boasted of his holdings, of the fertile land that bent to his will, of the wealth he claimed to wrestle from the stubborn mountains. And in that spring of 1842, He invited guests from the lowlands to see it all for themselves. It was to be a grand dinner, the kind where candles burn late into the night, where men drink until their laughter shakes the rafters, and women pick politely at food while their eyes sparkle with gossip. The master wanted to prove himself a king in a kingdom of rough wood and mountain stone, and as always, the cook was ordered to make it perfect. For 3 days she worked without rest. Dough rose in the corner, meat smoked over the fire, pots boiled with stews, rich enough to perfume the whole cabin. Her hands moved steadily, chopping, stirring, tasting, but her eyes gave nothing away. Not fatigue, not resentment, not even hunger. She was a shadow in the kitchen, silent, watchful. The enslaved children whispered about her in the yard. They said she spoke to the pots as if they were alive. They said she lingered too long over a jar of herbs, her lips moving in a tongue none of them understood. One boy swore he saw her hold a root to the light, her expression calm and unreadable, before slipping it into the broth. They dared not ask questions. They only watched, wide-eyed, as the kitchen filled with smells both sweet and bitter. By the evening of the feast, the table gleamed. Platters of roasted venison glistened with fat. Biscuits, golden and steaming, sat piled high in baskets. Pies cooled on the sill, their syrup bubbling thickly through broken crusts. Wine glowed red in the lamplight, and the master preened as though he had conjured it all himself. The guests praised the spread before the first bite had even been taken. She moved silently among them, laying dishes with careful precision. To them she was invisible, just another servant, just another pair of hands. But as she passed behind each chair, her gaze lingered, heavy and deliberate. She saw the gluttony in their eyes, the careless way they tore bread, the greedy hands snatching for more, and she felt no fear. When the master raised his glass for a toast, she stood by the doorway, her apron stained with flour and smoke. His voice boomed with pride, praising his land, his guests, his own good fortune. He did not mention her, nor the hands that had carved his feast from nothing. He never had. The first bites were taken with delight. Compliments poured from greasy mouths. "The meat is tender," one guest declared, chewing loudly. "The seasoning is perfect," said another, licking his fingers. They reached for more, filling their plates, their cups, their bellies, and she watched. At first it was laughter, the kind that rang out in confidence, in arrogance. But slowly the sound began to falter, a cough here, a stifled gag there. One man's laughter broke off into a choke, his wineglass shattering against the floor. Another clutched his stomach, groaning as sweat beaded on his brow. Forks clattered against plates. The master barked for calm, his face flushed red, but even he could not ignore the way his wife doubled over, her hands trembling, her lips foaming. Panic spread across the table. Men lurched from their chairs, knocking them to the ground. Women screamed, though their cries were cut short by spasms that twisted their bodies into unnatural shapes. The cabin filled with the sounds of gagging, gasping bodies striking the floorboards. The fire crackled cheerfully in the hearth, a cruel mockery of the chaos. And through it all, she stood still, her face unreadable, her hands folded in front of her apron. She did not smile, she did not weep. She only watched as the room writhed and shuddered, as the air thickened with the stench of vomit and sweat, as life drained from eyes that had never seen her as human. One guest, crawling on the floor, reached for her ankle. His fingers, slick with bile, brushed against her skirt. She stepped back calmly, letting his hand fall limp. The master staggered toward her, rage in his eyes even as blood bubbled at his lips. He opened his mouth as if to curse her, but the words never came. His body collapsed at her feet, shaking once before falling still. The room grew quiet. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the settling creak of the cabin, and the faint scrape of her spoon against the bottom of an empty pot. She stirred it slowly, though nothing remained, the motion steady and endless. In that moment she was no longer their cook, no longer their servant. She was Something else, judge, executioner, ghost. No one knows how long she stood there, stirring an empty pot as the bodies cooled around her. Some say she hummed a tune low and steady, like a lullaby. Others claim she whispered to the fire, thanking it for keeping her secret. What is certain is that when morning came, no laughter, no boasting, no life remained in the cabin. The bitter feast, they would call it, the night the table turned from celebration to grave. Those who tell the story say she disappeared after that night. Some insist she fled into the mountains, vanishing into hollows so deep no man could follow. Others swear she was hanged in secret, her body burned to ash to erase her crime. But if that were true, why do travelers still hear the scrape of her spoon? Why does the air near the cabin still taste bitter? The truth is simpler and more terrible. She never left. Her body may have vanished, but her hunger remained. A hunger not for food, but for justice, for remembrance, for power denied in life, but claimed in death. And so she stirs still. And if you pass by the cabin on a quiet night, when the moon is thin and the air heavy, you may see it. The faint glow of fire in the hearth, the shadow of a woman bending over a pot, and the smell of stew rising on the wind. But take care, for if you step too close, you may find yourself a guest at her table, and she serves only one dish. Death. They buried the first victims in shallow graves on the ridge. Their markers, nothing more than rough-hewn crosses of oak, hammered into the earth with calloused hands. But the dirt would not stay still. Within weeks the ground buckled, splitting open with rain, as though the soil itself was spitting their bodies back out. Mothers whispered it was no ordinary death. Fathers muttered of sickness. But even the bravest men refused to linger long by those crooked graves at night. The story should have ended there, another tale of loss in the harsh mountains. Yet it did not. Something clung to the cabin, to the clearing where the cook had once stirred her iron pots. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney, but neighbors swore they could smell scorched cornmeal or hear the scrape of a spoon against the kettle in the black hours before dawn. The cook herself was gone. Some swore she had fled under cover of night, barefoot and wild-eyed, slipping into the endless forest where even hunters dared not follow. Others whispered of a shadowy execution, that the masters had hanged her by the river, burying her secret beside the current. But whether she had escaped or been silenced, her absence only deepened the terror.
For the deaths did not end with her departure. Families who dared move into the cabin found misfortune waiting. A farmer who came with his young bride lasted barely 3 months. His cattle wasted to bone, his wife coughed blood into her apron, and the creek behind the house turned the color of rust. They fled in the middle of the night, leaving their belongings scattered like bones across the yard. The next tenants fared no better. A preacher from Virginia, certain he could drive out whatever devil haunted the land, arrived with his flock. He carved crosses into every door, splashed holy water on the windowsills, and filled the rooms with the heavy sound of hymns. But his infant son died in his sleep, his wife lost her sight after drinking from the well, and even his parishioners abandoned him one by one. The preacher stayed until his mind broke. Neighbors later found him pacing the front porch, muttering scripture in a voice so low it seemed to crawl under the skin. Word spread through the valley that the land was poisoned, not by man's neglect but by the cook's hand. She poured her rage into the earth, they whispered around firesides. Her bitterness seeps through the wood, her hate rides the wind. Appalachian superstition grew thick around the story. Women sewed small pouches of salt and pinned them to their children's clothes, lest the spirit drift down the holler and claim them in the night. Men carved crude excess into their doors and warned travelers not to stop near the cabin after dark. Some swore they saw a figure at the window, a woman with hollow eyes and skin like ash, stirring a pot that was no longer there. Yet others, darker in spirit, treated the place as a challenge. Boys dared each other to spend a night inside, only to return pale and trembling, unable to speak of what they had seen. Hunters cut across the clearing in daylight, but more than one emerged claiming their dogs had refused to enter, tails tucked, howling as though whipped by unseen hands. It was the water, they said, that bore the deepest mark. Once sweet and cold, the spring ran bitter after her disappearance. No matter how often new settlers tried to dig fresh wells, The taste lingered, metallic, heavy, as though the earth itself bled into the cup. To drink from it was to invite sickness, boils rising on the skin, teeth crumbling to dust, and fevers that no prayer or poultice could cure. By then the cabin was less a home than a warning. Travelers marked it on their maps with a simple black dot. Preachers avoided it on their circuits, claiming the devil's hand had rooted there. And the locals, the ones who had once whispered her name in fear, spoke of her as something larger than human. Not just a woman wronged, not merely a servant with vengeance in her heart, but a spirit bound to the stones of the chimney, to the splintered floorboards, to the air itself. Still, some claimed the curse was not hers at all, but the land's, a punishment for years of cruelty and silence. "You can't bury suffering," one old grandmother muttered, rocking on her porch as the wind rattled her rafters. "It seeps up through the soil. It waits for you." Whether it was the cook's ghost or the sins of those who had used her, the result was the same. Death walked that ground. And though the cabin sagged with rot and vines curled up its chimney like fingers, no axe could bring it down. Each time someone tried to dismantle it, their tools broke or their arms failed with sudden weakness. The structure stood, defiant, its shadow longer than any dwelling of its size had a right to be. In the evenings, when the fog sank low and the whippoorwills cried from the trees, the valley seemed to lean toward the clearing, as though the earth itself bent in reverence or fear. Folks began to say that anyone who disturbed the place would feel her hunger, that she still lingered in the smoke, waiting to be remembered not as a servant but as a reckoning. And so the land was left alone. A scar on the ridge. A hollow no one claimed. A place where superstition thickened into folklore, and folklore hardened into truth. For in the Appalachian hills, where the line between story and memory runs thin as mist, there are places you simply do not go. And this cabin, this cursed patch of earth, was chief among them. The cabin lay abandoned, its chimney cracked, its roof sagging beneath the weight of moss and rot. Yet the silence that hung over the place was not the silence of emptiness. Neighbors swore that the valley itself spoke at night. If you walked too close to the clearing after sundown, you might hear it. The faint clatter of pots and pans, the hiss of grease in a skillet, the steady scrape of a wooden spoon against cast iron. No one dared approach, though a few tried. Boys on the cusp of manhood, eager to prove themselves brave, crept into the weeds and pressed their ears against the warped wood. What they reported chilled even the hardiest old men. One boy swore he heard humming, low, mournful, the kind of song a mother might croon to a child. Another claimed he smelled bread baking, sweet and warm, though the hearth had been cold for years. A third said he saw her shadow moving across the walls, though the cabin was dark as a coffin. By morning, all three were struck with fevers, their lips cracked, their eyes glassy, as though something had followed them home. It wasn't only the children who felt it. Farmers passing through on their way to town often reported that their horses balked near the ridge. The animals reared, eyes rolling, refusing to step closer no matter how sharply the reins were pulled. "They can see what we can't," the locals muttered, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Beasts know the truth." And still the stories multiplied. A woman hanging laundry at dusk swore she heard her name called from the woods behind the cabin, though she lived miles away. An old trapper claimed that while hunting near the clearing, he saw a figure bent over the fire pit, stirring something invisible with a spoon. When he called out, the figure lifted its head and showed him a face without eyes. He dropped his rifle and fled, never returning to the ridge again. The most terrifying stories, though, came from those who dreamed. For in the valley dreams carried weight. Men and women alike began to report visions of sitting at a long wooden table, plates set before them, steam rising from bowls they could not see. A woman, always the same woman, gaunt, dark-skinned, with hollow eyes, served them. But the food was wrong. Meat crawled with worms, bread oozed with blood, water shimmered black as tar. Those who woke from such dreams found themselves unable to eat for days, their stomachs twisted, their minds clouded with dread. Why then, the cook's story was no longer just memory. It was legend. Mothers used her name to hush unruly children. "Don't wander off or she'll feed you her cursed stew." Preachers warned their congregations against the devil's trickery, pointing toward the ridge as proof that Satan could dwell in any hearth. And still the people whispered her name, half in fear, half in awe. Some swore she was not damned but powerful, that she had learned to bend death itself to her will, to strike back at those who owned her with a vengeance sharper than any knife. She poured her hate into her cooking, they said. She fed them her rage, spoon by spoon, until it poisoned their blood. But there was another version of the story, quieter and more dangerous. This version claimed she was no monster at all, but a martyr. A woman who had chosen to fight the only way left to her, through the food she was forced to serve. They said the earth itself had risen to protect her memory, to curse anyone who dared forget what she had suffered. Whichever story you believed, the result was the same. No one went near the cabin after dark. The path to the ridge grew wild with briars, the door sagged on its hinges, and the windows yawned like empty sockets. Yet at night, when the wind howled through the holler and the trees rattled their bare branches, those who lived within earshot swore they still heard her. The hiss of a skillet, the scrape of a spoon, the whisper of a song in a language older than the mountains themselves. And in those hours, when the valley seemed to hold its breath, the line between the living and the dead blurred. People locked their doors, stoked their fires high, and prayed the sound would pass them by. For in the Appalachian hills, it was said, the dead did not always rest. And the cook, whether spirit, curse, or memory, was far from finished. The ridge was avoided by most. Even the boldest hunters and trappers cut wide circles around the cabin's clearing, muttering prayers under their breath as they passed. But every legend draws the curious, and in time the story of the slave cook's cursed land reached ears far beyond the valley. The first to come were scholars. In the 1840s, a professor from Virginia arrived with notebooks and a small entourage of students, eager to collect the superstitions of the Appalachian people. He declared the talk of curses mere ignorance, the product of isolation and fear. When he stood in the clearing, he called out loudly that no spirit could harm a man of reason. He even scoffed at the locals' warnings, daring to spend the night inside the cabin. By morning the professor was gone. His students found his bedroll neatly folded, his papers scattered across the dirt floor, and his shoes still by the door. His body was never recovered. Some claimed he fled in shame, others swore they saw him wandering the treeline months later, barefoot and babbling, his eyes empty of recognition. Next came the fortune seekers. Men who believed the land must hold treasure buried by frightened owners, or perhaps valuables left behind when families fled. Two brothers from Kentucky came with shovels and whiskey, laughing off the valley folk who warned them. They dug deep into the clearing by lantern light, convinced they would strike gold. But when dawn broke, the brothers were found collapsed beside their pit, their mouths blackened, their fingernails torn bloody from clawing the earth. One was dead, the other mad, his mind shattered beyond repair. He could only whisper the same words over and over, "She fed me, she fed me." And yet the cabin still drew people. Preachers, treasure hunters, scholars, even wanderers with nothing left to lose. Each left with the same story, strange sounds in the night, the smell of food cooking though no fire burned, the sensation of being watched by eyes that belonged to no living soul. What unsettled the locals most, however, were the visitors who never returned at all. Whole parties sometimes vanished, 2 men hunting, a family passing through, even a group of soldiers during the war who chose the cabin as shelter. None were ever seen again. Their belongings would be discovered, knapsacks, rifles, clothing, but their bodies dissolved into the legend of the ridge. Over time, whispers grew that it was not simply a spirit haunting the land, but that the land itself had developed a hunger. The chimney, cracked and leaning, became its mouth. The soil, bitter and black, its stomach. And the sound of spoons scraping pots in the dead of night? That was its promise. A meal forever unfinished, calling out to the living to join the dead. Not all who visited came by choice. A boy once lost his way while hunting rabbits, stumbling into the clearing at dusk. He returned home hours later, pale as milk, trembling so violently his teeth clattered. He spoke of a woman who appeared at the doorway, her skin gray, her apron stained. She beckoned him inside with a hand too thin to belong to the living. When he refused, she smiled, showing teeth too sharp to be human. His parents prayed over him for weeks, but he never spoke again. By now, the locals believed the place beyond salvation. Crosses carved into doors had failed. Holy water boiled off the windowsills. Preachers prayed until their voices cracked, yet the curse grew stronger. Even the most skeptical came to admit the truth. Something in that cabin was alive, though it should not be. It was not just haunted, it was waiting. And so, the ridge became a place of fearful reverence. People pointed it out from afar, warning children not to wander near. Old women told its story by firelight, rocking in their chairs as the wind moaned down the holler. Travelers were advised to keep moving, no matter how weary or hungry they grew. Still, every few years someone came. And every few years the legend deepened. For in the Appalachians, where memory is long and silence carries weight, the past never truly dies. It lingers, whispering from cracks in the walls and from the soil beneath your feet. And those who step too close to the cook's cursed cabin are never sure if they are walking into a story, or if the story is walking into them. By the late 19th century, the cabin had become more than a haunted place. It was a scar. Every valley has one, a hollow the elders warn about, a ridge that draws storms, a clearing where no grass grows. But this cabin was different. It didn't just sit there rotting into the earth, it breathed. At night, smoke-like shapes curled from the chimney though no fire burned. The boards creaked as if under unseen footsteps. And those who lingered too long felt the weight of eyes pressing into their backs. The people of the valley had learned to live with it, in the way one learns to live with a wound that will not heal. They warned their children, they whispered their prayers, and they let the cabin stand. But then came the summer of 1891, when a sickness swept through the holler. Cattle fell dead in their fields. Children wasted to bone in a matter of weeks. The river turned sour, fish floating belly up. Some said it was cholera. Others knew better. "The land's still eating," muttered old Mary Fletcher, her hands trembling as she pointed her cane toward the ridge. "She's hungry again." The valley folk had tolerated the curse as long as it stayed chained to the cabin. But now it seemed to be spreading, leaking into their farms, their wells, their very bodies. Desperation breeds courage, or madness, and so a group of men decided to put an end to it once and for all. There were 6 of them, armed with axes, hammers, and whiskey. They waited until sundown, when the sky turned red over the mountains, and marched toward the ridge. Neighbors watched from a distance, too fearful to follow. Some prayed for their success, others prayed for their souls. The men entered the clearing and wasted no time. With shouts and curses, they swung their axes into the walls, their hammers into the stones of the chimney. The cabin groaned under the blows, its timbers splintering, its windows shattering into shards. They set fire to the floorboards, feeding the flames with kerosene until smoke poured upward like a black banner. At first it seemed they had won. The fire roared, swallowing the roof, consuming the walls, until the structure collapsed inward with a thunderous crash. The men cheered, raising their bottles in triumph. But their victory was short-lived. From the ruins a sound rose, a low, hollow wail that silenced their voices. It was not the crack of burning wood, nor the howl of wind. It was a cry, deep and mournful, like the voice of a woman who had lost everything. The men froze, their bottles slipping from their hands, their weapons clattering to the ground. The flames shifted then, twisting upward into shapes that should not have been possible. Shadows writhed within the fire, forming the figure of a woman stirring an unseen pot. Her face was blank, her eyes pits of darkness, her mouth stretched wide in a smile that was not human. One of the men fell to his knees, clawing at his throat as if choking on smoke. Another staggered backward into the trees, his screams fading into the night. The others turned to run, but the ground beneath them split, swallowing their steps with a hiss like boiling grease. By dawn, only ashes remained where the cabin had stood. Ashes and bones. Charred fragments of ribs, fingers curled like claws, a skull blackened and grinning. Whether they belonged to the cook, her victims, or the men who tried to destroy her, no one could say. The valley folk did not speak of it openly, but everyone knew. The cabin had not been destroyed. Its pieces still lingered, stones from the chimney scattered in the weeds, blackened beams buried in the soil. The land itself held the memory of what had been done there, and memory in those mountains was stronger than fire. In the years that followed, the sickness eased, but the fear did not. Travelers still vanished near the ridge. Hunters still claimed to hear pots clattering in the night. Children still woke screaming from dreams of sitting at that endless table, fed food that turned to ash in their mouths. And more than once, when the moon was full and the mist lay thick in the holler, locals swore they saw smoke rising again from the clearing, thin, gray, curling like fingers toward the sky. The reckoning had not ended. It had only begun. They say time heals all things. But in the Appalachian hills, time doesn't heal. It remembers. The ridge where the cabin once stood has long been swallowed by trees, its chimney stones scattered and moss-choked, its floorboards buried under layers of earth. On the surface, it looks like nothing more than another forgotten clearing. Birds nest in the branches above. Deer tread quietly through the weeds. If you didn't know better, you might think it peaceful. But the valley folk know better. They always have. Old families whisper the warnings to their children even now. Don't wander the ridge after dark. Don't drink from the spring. And if you hear someone humming, don't you dare follow it. Because while the cabin may be gone, the hunger that lived there has never left. Over the decades, more stories piled like dead leaves. A hunter in 1927 found his way to the clearing on a moonless night. He returned home 3 days later, starving and half-mad, insisting he had been fed, though he hadn't touched a bite of real food. His breath stank of spoiled meat. His tongue was black. He died raving about a long table, a woman with hollow eyes serving him dish after dish of things that writhed on the plate. In 1952, a pair of hikers vanished near the ridge. Their tent was discovered intact, their belongings neatly laid out, but the ashes of a fire smoldered beside something no one could explain. Cast iron pots, blackened spoons, and bowls filled with grease, still warm, though no one had lit a fire in that place for decades. The locals do not question these things. They do not search for explanations. They've learned that curiosity is a kind of invitation. The cook's story has become more than a tale, it's a test. A reminder that cruelty poisons deeper than blood, that suffering does not vanish when you bury it in shallow graves. It lingers, it feeds, and sometimes it looks for company. You see, the legend says she never cooked alone. That after she died, or vanished depending on who you ask, her spirit began gathering guests. Travelers, settlers, the curious, the greedy, the unbelieving. One by one she sets them down at her endless table. One by one she serves them. Some are fed until their bodies give out. Others are never seen again. But her table never empties. Even now, when the fog rolls down the holler and the woods grow too quiet, people swear they can smell her food on the wind. Cornbread, meat stew, sweet cider gone sour. If you catch the scent, you're already too close. And if you hear the scrape of her spoon, steady as a heartbeat, it means she's stirring the pot, waiting for you. They call it the Last Supper because no one walks away from her table the same. Some say if you listen hard enough, in the dead hours of night, you can hear it. A clatter of dishes. The clink of iron against iron. The sound of chairs being pulled across a wooden floor that rotted away more than a century ago. And if you dare peek through the trees, if you dare look into that clearing when the mist is thick, you might just see the glow of firelight, soft and golden, as though the cabin has risen again from its ashes. A table set. Bowls steaming. Shadows seated where no living person should be. And at the head of the table, the cook herself, gaunt, smiling, waiting with her ladle poised. She will beckon you closer. She always does. Some swear that if you run you can escape. That you might hear her laughter chasing you through the woods. But if you make it to your doorstep before she calls your name, you'll live to see the sunrise. But most never get that chance. Most sit. Most eat. Most never come back. And maybe that's the darkest part of all, because if you think about it, her curse isn't just vengeance. It's hunger. Hunger born from years of silence, cruelty, and pain. Hunger that cannot be filled. So, if you ever find yourself in those hills, remember the warnings. Stay off the ridge after dark. Don't drink from the spring. And if you smell food cooking where no fire burns, hold your breath, close your eyes, and run. Because she's still waiting. And the table is never quite full. Now, close your eyes. Imagine the woods quiet, the fog sinking low, the faint smell of something cooking on the night air. Ask yourself, if she set a place for you at her table tonight, would you know when to say no? Or would you sit down, smiling just like all the others? Sleep well.